Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and today we're doing something a little bit different from our regular programming. Earlier this week, I told my newsletter subscribers to basically just ask me a question. It could be any question relating to the media industry, being a media entrepreneur, the creator economy, you name it. And several of you wrote in with questions. After that, I asked another media veteran named Craig Edinger to come on a podcast episode with me, and did our best to answer the questions that you all sent in. Craig has a long history in media. He spent over 15 years working on the finance side of Time Inc., and he later was a VP of finance at Condé Nast. Today, he runs his own consulting business where he works with publishers and other small businesses to create and monetize their websites. This is going to be an ongoing feature that I have for my podcast, probably going to do it about once a month. And while these episodes are freely available for anyone to listen to or watch, you can only submit questions if you're a paying subscriber to my newsletter. You probably noticed that I don't really have much advertising on this podcast. Everything I do for it, all the long form interviews I do with media entrepreneurs and successful creators, that's all funded through my newsletter, mostly through paying subscribers. So if you've ever wanted to interact with me directly, either through this podcast or through my ongoing office hours series, this is a great time to become a paying subscriber to my newsletter. Go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google my name, Simon Owens, and newsletter, and you'll find it at the top of your search results. I'm so grateful for my paying subscribers because they really make everything I do every single week possible. Okay, let's jump into my discussion with Craig, and we're going to try our best to answer your questions. Hey, Craig, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
So I brought you on today to answer some questions from my audience that were submitted in advance, and I thought you were the perfect guest to have on to this because you just have like such a significant background in media, working especially on the business side. Tell us a little bit, like just give us kind of the cliff notes of your background.
Sure. So I spent about 15 years or so at Time Inc. In a number of roles. Have a finance background actually, so that's kind of my skill set is based in finance and more on the numbers side. But eventually, I worked my way up the ladder at Time Inc. And became general manager of Time.com, where I had responsibility for audience development, product development, sales planning. So really, my background while I was at Time Inc., I covered kind of the gamut of the business side, and then continued to push hard on some of the product development skills that I had started acquiring. I really found that interesting. I launched a mobile app of my own after I left Time Inc., so I did that for a while. Um, then I moved over to Condé Nast and spent a few years there as VP of finance and overseeing several of their larger brands in what was called the culture division. So it included the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Wired, Ars Technica, and Pitchfork and Teen Vogue. So
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
wide
So
range
you
of
were
brands.
you were deep in the business of two of the kind of premier magazine publishers
Yeah.
of the 20th century, and obviously Time was eventually sold to Meredith, and now is parts of it are now split up and
Yes.
run by various billionaires. But then you also worked at Condé Nast, which is experiencing a little bit of a comeback right now. Just had its, I think, first profitable year within the last decade or so. It has done a lot to do kind of like a digital transformation. And today you're running basically a consulting business for publishers, right?
Yeah, so I pretty much since the pandemic, I've been doing consulting for small businesses. I do some media consulting as well. So, yeah, do working on websites, helping businesses with their kind of online media strategy, but also their finances, et cetera.
Yeah. So, given this deep backbench of experience working for both large media companies and also consulting with media companies, I want to get your kind of initial impression of this new website that's gotten a lot of buzz that just launched within the last week or so. It's called The Messenger. So, for those who don't know, this is a company that was co-founded by a guy named Jimmy Finkelstein, who was a co-owner of The Hill, and to his credit, really turned The Hill, this kind of like small Capitol Hill newspaper that was mainly print centric, leading up to the internet age, like really kind of digitized it and was able to sell it for many multiples that it had been than its original value. So he sold that, I think, for over $100 million, and then he started raising money for this new venture. I think he's raised over $50 million in venture capital, and it's got this whole ethos, this idea that there's this market for quote unquote centrist news, that supposedly all the other mainstream media outlets are too polarized on either end of the spectrum, and that there's this massive marketplace for centrist journalism, right down the middle journalism. Like I said, he raised like $50 million. I think he was planning to launch with over 150 journalists from the start, and he claims, or he's projected, that he's going to bring in $100 million. Have you obviously there's a lot of discussion around it when it first launched. What was kind of
Sure.
like your initial impression? I guess like the first question I have for you is it true that there's this supposed like this mass market for centrist news, whatever that means?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know CNN has shifted a bit under its new ownership. They're trying to be more of a centrist news organization, or more centrist than they used to be. So, sure, there is a market for it. The question is, how do you actually present that, as a brand? What does that mean? It's really, so I think that's the challenge. But, the question, I think the bigger question is, even if you can pull that off, how big is that market, right? How many people can you pull in? And the numbers that they're, projecting or aiming for are really astronomical. I mean, that was my first impression. They're looking to get to 100 million monthly unique visitors, I think, next year. So, you know, in the first 18 months or so. And that's just an enormous number. I mean, none of the brands that I worked on ever reached that scale. Um, and they're well known, Time, New Yorker, Vanity Fair. Sure, they're not the biggest brands, but you know, great editorial, tons of effort into growing the audience and building a profitable business, and they were, not anywhere near that scale. So it's a huge climb for them. Um, that was my first takeaway was, aside from the revenue goal, which is ambitious, but the traffic goal itself, I think is really going to be tough to hit.
Well, like it feels like it's from this bygone era. Like I feel like it's almost like a pitch for Huffington Post circa 2008. This idea that, we're
Sure.
going to get really big, we're going to use aggregation, rewriting, kind of this hyper curation of news, and we're going to be pumping out so much content at such a high pace that we're going to scale up a huge audience, and basically monetize it with what looks like, from what I can tell right now, is like programmatic display advertising and outbrain links. It just seems like if there's any lesson we've learned from the last like 5 years, is that kind of scale game. With the decline of BuzzFeed, the bankruptcy of Vice News, the struggle, like the shutting down of lots of these like VC funded media orgs that raised a lot of money, the Mashables, the Mikes of the world. Don't you think this is like a decade old idea basically at this point?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it definitely is a throwback to kind of the 2010s era, I would say. Um, but I guess they're trying to zig while everyone else is zagging. There's been a lot of kind of talk in media circles about, the need to kind of niche down, right? Go after smaller, more targeted audiences. The days of going big may be over. So is it possible, taking this counterintuitive approach could work? Possibly. I just think it's going to be really challenging. It's much more difficult to drive that kind of traffic by building a large social footprint, on Twitter, Facebook, et cetera. Certainly, trying to approach traffic through Google, that's going to get more challenging. Even as a daily news brand, I think it's going to be tougher as the kind of AI tools are integrated into the search experience. So, I think they're fighting a big uphill battle, no matter how you look at it, for sure.
Well, like your background is in finance. Like, do you
Mhm.
think that they're going to get there with just like display advertising? It just seems like the CPMs never fully materialized there to where there was this theory that if you could just reach enough scale that you could like kind of overcome those kind of market forces. Do you think that, I mean, especially when you consider that they're raising VC funding and VCs expect to make 10 times, 100 times,
Yeah.
on what they invested? I mean, are the economics even there?
Yeah, I'm guessing no. They say that the majority of the revenue will be advertising. Some of it will come through event sponsorships, right? So it's not necessarily all display, but you're going to have a massive display business to come anywhere near that number. But you know, if you look at successful publishers, and they've all been trying different ways to monetize, right? And I think the end result is you really need a combination of revenue streams in order to become a cash flow positive, a profitable business, right? So it's not just advertising, it's subscription. And I think they reference, in the future sometime they'll look to build in a more premium content business, but that is extremely difficult to do. So you also, right, affiliate marketing, affiliate commerce has become big. But unless you're doing something like what the Times did, where they went out and bought Wirecutter as a way to kickstart their significant e-commerce business, I think it's hard as a news brand to build a really strong e-commerce, affiliate marketing business. And while they will have some lifestyle verticals, um, you've got to spend an enormous amount of time building out not just the editorial staff, but a commerce, a staff that's also expert in commerce and knows how to write the right articles and optimize for SEO there. So I just think they're taking on a lot, and they have to, my sense is, exceed, they're going to have to be flawless in their execution across all these different channels in order to get anywhere close in terms of traffic and revenue.
Yeah,
Maybe,
especially since
yeah,
it seems like they're burning through cash very quickly.
yeah,
They really supposedly they're not going to raise any more money. So like this $50 million
sure,
dollars is their own runway. There was another buzzy general news startup that launched a few months ago by Justin Smith, the former subscriptions guy at
right.
Bloomberg, and Ben Smith, the former BuzzFeed News editor and New York Times columnist. They raise far less money, and they seem to be a little bit focused. They're just hiring star reporters, and they're very scoop driven versus the
Right.
scale for scale's sake. Which one of those two models are you more kind of bullish on, do you think?
Definitely the semaphore one for sure. I think, yeah, they're also not. I think the idea of raising a ton of money up front, right? We've all seemed to learn that that puts so much pressure on the business to operate a certain way that that alone can take you down. So I think the semaphore approach of not raising too much money, certainly their editorial, at least from what we've seen already, is much stronger than what you're seeing on the Messenger. It's more thoughtful. Their presentation is better. The user experience is better. I mean, everything so far. We want to give the Messenger a chance. They say this is their beta version, but you know, I feel like, Semaphore is so far off to a much better start than the Messenger for sure.
And like you said, it seems like the companies that are set up to succeed are the ones that are A, going niche, and then B, not doing these massive fundraisers, maybe just raising enough to hire a few initial staff members and then try to test out
Right.
the marketplace. So this kind of segues into the first question from my audience. I wrote this article yesterday about whether we're entering a media recession, and I got an email back from a high up executive at a very prominent media organization. I didn't get his permission, so I can't say his name, but he did have an interesting question that I wanted to start with because it kind of jumps off of this whole conversation around the messenger. And his question was, do you think we've hit a key inflection point in media where suddenly being profitable, not just chasing scale, and having a solid biz model are now more important than ever? So like, kind of talking about what you're saying about the VC fundraising and stuff like that. Do you think that like this idea of like people just giving these media companies gobs of money to chase scale, is that era mostly over? The messenger aside.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems that way for now. Of course, you know, I think whether we're in an ad recession or a full-blown recession now or entering one, we know the economy goes in cycles. I think the way media operates certainly goes in cycles. What's old is what's new again. So it's certainly for the time being, for probably the next, several years at least, I think the idea of, well, and the VC firms are certainly less likely to want to fund big media startups. So I think from both sides, I think media entrepreneurs are less likely to want to raise big rounds even if they can, and VCs are, it's going to be much harder to raise that money if you are looking to raise money. So
And then it's even harder to technically even reach audience scale now, right? Because we're talking
oh
about,
yeah.
you hear these people talking about going into this post social age where social networks like Facebook and Twitter, and even Google increasingly are no longer focused on sending gobs of traffic to publishers. Like, do you think that's a true trend that's actually emerging, that like, that it's going to get harder and harder to even achieve that kind of scale, even if you wanted to?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think so. You'll still have, I think some unicorn will come out of nowhere, whether it's some kind of social product or something in the, more traditional media space. I think there's still that, you never know, right? What's out there and what may take off. But by and large, I'd say the scale era is over. Uh, and a lot of it was a land grab in some ways. Obviously, from a funding standpoint, the low interest rate environment, going all the way back to, you know, 2009, 2010, that helped from a funding standpoint. Um, and I just think there was a lot of experimentation, which was amazing, which was great. And some things worked well. Some things worked well initially, but then were really hard to maintain. And a lot of that had to do with the buildup of the social platforms and the way that, they would change kind of their focus and their strategy and their approach, every couple of years, that really whipsawed the media companies that were reliant on them. Google less so, but even, any significant algorithm changes that Google did over the past, decade or so, some of those hit bigger publishers, the content farms, incredibly hard, and really took some of them out.
Also, it strikes me as like the industry wide pivot to subscriptions. There's going to be a lot less emphasis on traffic scale because most publishers have found that drive-by traffic coming in through Drudge, Facebook, even Google News, it's just traffic that's just bouncing right off your site. They're not sticking around, so the revenue per user is much lower than someone who's coming in through a newsletter, through a homepage, or something like that. So it just seems like even the business models themselves are pivoting away from scale and focusing. I mean, publishers are always claiming that they're focusing on quality over
Sure.
quantity traffic, but it seems like maybe that, is actually mattering more than ever.
Yeah, I mean, as a publisher, you're always looking for ways to fill the top of the funnel, right? But yes, if you're starting with a more focused approach and you're much more targeted in terms of, who you're going after, who your reader is, the type of content you're creating, investing in for that reader, um, your conversion rates are going to be higher, right? All else equal. And yes, I mean, being more thoughtful, more tactical about acquiring users, analyzing lifetime value versus customer acquisition cost. I think all of that points to being smarter, smaller, and more thoughtful about your editorial strategy and your audience strategy. So all that points to, I think, moving away from scale and mass audience, and the smaller is smarter approach.
I was trying to think of if I could think of any company that raised like over $20 million in VC funds. It ever ended up being super profitable out of all those companies. The only one I could sort of think of was like HuffPost, exited and sold, for $300 million to AOL. But I don't know that it was ever actually really profitable. But it did have a good exit because it got out at the right time. Can you think of any company that has taken it? Like you look at Vice Media, BuzzFeed, Mike,
Yeah.
Mashable, the Skim. Like it just seems like that was like the number one indicator of a recipe for disaster was taking in a massive amount of VC funding.
Yeah, I mean, the Insider, obviously originally Business Insider, they had a great exit. I'm not really sure how much money, if really any outside money they had raised. But
I think they raised a decent amount. Yeah.
yeah, and they certainly had a really good exit. Politico, had a nice exit too. I don't remember
Yeah,
how
but
much
Politico
money
was
they
very
raised.
disciplined. Well, they never raised any money.
Yeah,
They
right.
were owned by Robert Albitron, and if you listen to interviews with like Jim Vandehei, they were very disciplined with money. They were not spendthrift at all. So, yeah, I think that
Yeah.
they wouldn't count as like a VC backed type of company. Yeah, but the track
And
record isn't very good for
Axios,
it.
was
Axios, that's a good one.
Axios.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean
Axios raised a good bit of money. Yeah.
yeah. So, and it's a great product. And yeah, they were smart about it too.
Yeah, yeah, they were very smart about building a product based on emails, segmenting lists, building niche. Like they were a general interest publication, but they were very focused on building niche verticals within that publication. So I think that's why they
Right,
were
and
so
they
valuable.
had, they had a unique value proposition in terms of reaching, the mobile user, the on-the-go user looking for quick updates, but very smart, insightful takes at the same time. And so, I think that allowed them to attract, a fairly sizable audience and monetize them, that audience at a nice rate.
Yeah. So, given your finance background, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this next question. It comes from Bo Bruskern. He is a co-founder of a fast-growing fintech media startup that started with events and then moved into media. His question was, how can I test pricing? How do I know my subscription price is right? How can I measure price sensitivity? This is a question I get a lot from my readers based on talking to a lot of entrepreneurs and media operators. A lot of them tell me it's just a guessing game. Obviously Condé Nast, they built some great subscription products, especially with the New Yorker. What are some ways that publishers should be thinking about how to get the pricing right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one way certainly that, when you're doing when you're trying to come out with the right pricing model, you're going to be doing some price testing, right? So to the extent that you can leverage tools that allow you to do A/B testing or multivariate testing, right, where you're comparing, one price versus the other, but everything else is held equal for that audience. So you're trying to get a true read on which price is better. So I think, to the extent that you can do that, that's kind of the first most obvious tool.
So if I
Um,
understand you correctly, it's like creating an A/B test where user A is landing on the site and they're shown one price, and then user B is lands on the site and they're shown another price, and then collecting data at conversion rates over time to see
sure.
if they're converting at the same rate or widely different rates and stuff like that.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you can't do true A/B testing, you can try to, in a fairly tight time frame, change your price, right? Without, A/B testing or multivariate testing, you're doing it at the same time, right? And just splitting the audience so that fewer other factors, outside factors, are impacting the response. But if you can't do that, you can try to do it, over a 2 week period. You test one price, then a second 2 week period, you test another price. You're going to have some noise in there, but it lets you get some kind of read. Um, but I think, part of this is also looking at, what is it costing you to acquire that user? Whether you're actually spending on marketing, paid marketing, or even if you're not, but, what is the cost of your content, right? So you can at least estimate, okay, here's what it's costing me to bring readers in the top of funnel, to convert them, how many are converting, and you want to, over the long run, you want to make sure you're charging a high enough price that you're making money on these users. So that's, you can look from kind of the bottom up and look at your cost, and then add some kind of profit, build some profit margin in there to develop your pricing. um,
What about like more broad frameworks, like in terms of thinking who your audience is? Like, a kind of a general axiom is that like if it's a B2C customer or B2C
sure.
audience, they're more price sensitive and you should go lower versus a high end B2B audience, like something that's like geared towards people who work on Wall Street or the C
Right.
suite of like tech companies. Then they're less price sensitive. Do you think that kind of framework holds true, or is that too oversimplified in what people are willing to
No,
pay?
I mean, I think it does. With the higher, with a more B2B, right? If it's news you can use in general, right? That tends to allow you to price higher, whether it's as a consumer and it's, personal finance, health, parenting, right? Information that can really help you in your life, or right, in a B2B, in a work, capacity, where it's useful information. Of course, in the work capacity, there's the argument that you also can expense it on your corporate card, so that gives you more room in terms of, pricing flexibility. So I definitely, that definitely plays a role. Entertainment content that tends to be, less of a utility, generally, right? You can't price as much. Maybe retention rates are lower as well, right? So it's not just about the initial price where you bring someone in, but, are they going to renew? In the, if your content is good, even as, providing entertainment content, you're probably less likely to be able to retain that user over, multiple years, let alone multiple months, compared to in the B2B environment, where sure, you could carry someone for, 3 to 5 years if or more, if you have a good product.
What about like in terms of discounts? Like you see, especially a lot of large media companies, like the Condé Nast of the
Yeah.
world giving these massive discounts. Sometimes it's like really ridiculous, like $1 a month or something for some
Yeah.
period of time. Like, what's your philosophy on that? Like, some people like it to run up the subscription numbers. Other people feel like it's just a recipe for churn and just pissing, like setting bad
Yeah.
expectations for what content should cost. What's your philosophy on that?
Yeah. I mean, I guess my philosophy, sure, is the less discounting, right? The more true you can be in your initial, the initial contract price, right? The price where you're bringing someone in, the better, right? You're going to get a truer response in terms of renewal rates, and you know, but I do think it depends on the brand and the type of content. It for some it may be more beneficial to bring more in through the top and then test again on the renewal rates and the renewal pricing, right? So you can play with renewal pricing as well. So, I've seen it done, there's across a spectrum in terms of discounted rates, and then do you kind of quickly move them up to a higher price? Um, both can be effective, but my sense is over the long run, you're better off bringing someone in at a reasonable rate and, and focusing on retaining them without increasing rates substantially to get them to a lifetime value that's going to be profitable, right? So it's just being more consistent throughout the life of the contract is a better way to go about it.
Well, one thing I'd wonder to hear your thoughts on, and this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, is like the way that publishers go about raising prices. Like, I don't mind if they raise prices, but it kind of stinks that most of them will raise prices across the board. Like,
Mhm.
I always think you should reward your early adopters, your earliest customers, by just locking them in at the price whatever they paid. Like, I raised my prices at the beginning of this year, but I made sure that all my earliest supporters stayed at the price they were paying, because I felt like I owed that to them as like my
Yeah.
earliest supporters, my earliest customers. Like, what do you think of and I've seen some backlash when some publishers like the Washington Post suddenly ended these like Prime deals that they were given. Like, do you think there's a way they should be going about it that doesn't piss off customers?
Yeah, I mean, it is unusual when you think about it that some of your best, most long-standing customers could be paying the highest rates across your subscriber base, right? You would think that they're the ones that should be getting the best deal, should be treated the best. And certainly, for a smaller publisher when you start out, you know, that makes the most sense. And yeah, you want to treat all of your readers, your customers. You want to treat them well and with respect. um, when you're looking at a subscriber base with hundreds of thousands or millions of readers, you're going to see again a wide range of how people were brought in initially, how they've been retained. um, but again, I think that gets back to this idea of bringing readers in at a fair, reasonable rate that you believe can be maintained fairly well throughout their life. Of course, raising rates with inflation and other things. Um, the other thing to manage price, which publishers have gotten a little better about more recently, is you effectively lower the price by adding in more product, more offering, right? So whether it's just upgrading or giving them more of the original content that they were interested in, but also doing things like, right, the subscriber only newsletter, adding that in if you're, a website or a podcast that they have access to. Or one thing we were testing at Condé Nast was the idea of, okay, do you give them an audio version of the articles? Especially for something like the New Yorker, when you have these 5, 10,000 word articles or more, that was a big benefit to be able to listen to, the article rather than read it. So offering those, adding those types of content that really add utility and value to the subscription is a great way to, yes, you may be raising the price over time, but you're giving them even more value than that price would warrant. So I think managing your subscriber base that way is a smart way to go about it as well.
What about offering steep discounts as a way to reduce churn? Like when someone is going to cancel their subscription, say providing them some kind of message. We'll get if you stay on, we'll give you a 50% discount for the next year. Did you guys test any of that out? At Condé Nast.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as familiar yes. I mean, I think every um, consumer marketing team will test not just to existing subscribers and when they go to cancel, but even during the checkout process, the initial checkout process. If you're acquiring users online, you might do what's called a rescue pop-up or some other thing, so that if they user has started the checkout process, but they go to there's an abandoned cart. If you've already captured their email, but they haven't paid, can you email them and say, hey, right, you forgot to complete your order. We'll give you a discount. Or even before they leave the site, right, on exit, there's a pop-up that says, hey, we saw you were interested in subscribing. Can we, we'll offer you this to complete the order. So doing things like that really do have an impact. So I think, certainly when you're initially trying to acquire users and convert them, but also certainly throughout their life, as you're trying to improve retention rates. That those tactics work well, and I think, if you're giving value, it can be a great way to keep that relationship strong with the user.
So our next question comes from Margie Whiteleather. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. And her question is: tell us about the role of audience engagement editor that's developed at publishers. Who does it report to? How does it interact with marketing and with circulation and subscriptions? What skills are needed? What positions might a person advance to from that role? And I really like this question because back in like 2011, 2012, I was hired at US News and World Report, and the title of audience development editor didn't exist at that point. But it was, if you looked at my job description, it really, like, it basically fit that role. And I have to say, it was like one of the most difficult jobs for me to navigate because the role had never really existed before, to where I didn't really know what my authority was. I felt like I was constantly, stepping on people's feet. There were territorial, people who thought I was encroaching on their kind of jobs and stuff like that. And it was just kind of, a completely miserable experience. And I eventually just kind of got relegated to being the social media editor, since nobody cared about that all that much, which was very boring and not super fulfilling to me. So I guess my question to you, as someone who has worked on the audience development side, where should the audience development editor fit within the organization? Should they have any control or influence over the actual content, or is their job solely to find an audience for the content? You get what I'm asking there? Like what role should they be in the content creation process?
So audience development, at least the way I've seen it spans across both edit and business, right? And there are multiple roles within the overall audience development umbrella. So this may not answer the question directly, but there are multiple pieces. It, there's the analytics piece, right? There's the piece where you make sure you have all the tools and your products, whether it's the website or your mobile apps, everything is tagged properly so that you can track, right, the data to be able to monitor the performance of your audience development efforts, right? So all of that's critical, right? So there's the kind of analytics and data acquisition piece to it, and you need someone on the team that really oversees that. And then, it's all about informing. The rest of it is about informing, I think, your editorial team, but your business team as well. For the editorial team, I do think, I've seen it done different ways where the audience development person is is making sure the everyone on the editorial team is really educated and informed, and they're almost like a coach, making sure they know how to do SEO, and they're fluent in social media, and doing all the right things. Then I've seen it where the audience development person has much more of a direct role in, um, maybe not assigning stories, but working with the managing editor to make sure the right types of stories are being considered, where there are pockets of, I guess, news, voids in the news coverage where, okay, we could be doing better here. So I think it really depends. And the one thing that's clear is having a really strong audience development leader, but also a team that can handle all these roles, both on the analytics side, the reporting side, but also working very closely with the editorial staff to make sure what the editors are producing is optimized and has the best chance of being found in search, and performing well across social media. It's a obviously an essential role.
Yeah,
um,
it sounds like what you're saying is they need to be a good diplomat, not someone who dictates what people do, but a good someone who can educate them and nudge them in the direction of making decisions that are good for the overall audience engagement.
yeah, I mean, I think that's true of any position when you're working with the editorial staff. Um, and with the business staff. I mean, you have to be diplomatic in these roles where you're not necessarily the creator of the content, right? Or working with a sales team, and you're not the one out there actually trying to sell. Maybe you're working in sales support role or a marketing role. You have to be diplomatic about it, because ultimately it's a salesperson working with the brand or the agency that has to close the piece of business, and they're ultimately responsible for it. It's the editorial team. They're out there writing these stories, doing the reporting, doing the research, fact checking, making sure you're putting out the best stories for the users. You have to, go with a light touch when you're supporting these teams, right? And enabling them to be the best at what they're doing.
Well, I was a few years back. I landed on a major news site, and it had really egregious autoplay video and ad tech and stuff like that. And I just happened to mutually followed the audience engagement editor at that publication, and I sent her a snarky tweet about that, like, how can you be focused on audience engagement and allow this to happen? And her tweet back basically said something to the effect of, that was not my call. Like, basically
Right.
someone on the business side had made that decision and it was out of her hands, which to me just seems so, like, why would you have an audience development editor and not allow them to make calls like that? Do you think they should have veto power over UX issues that will, overall over the long term hurt their relationship with the audience?
I mean, ultimately, someone has to be responsible, right? I think the bigger problem is there often isn't one person responsible for making that type of call, or at least it's not clear who that person is. And so what happens is, yes, you might get audience development or audience engagement. They're probably working closely with product and engineering, right? And they may agree, okay, this is how our page templates should be built, and this is how many ad slots we should have, and you know, this is how quickly things need to load, and so they're focused on user experience, right? Reader experience, and obviously that's competing with the business side that needs to optimize the RPM, or the revenue per page. If you have someone in the middle, and typically often that's a general manager type role, or some kind of someone that sits in the middle and appreciates both sides of um, a decision on this, that can really kind of take it all in, and you know make a decision on what's best, right? Not just in the short run, but in the long run, what's going to be best, right? Yes, in the short run, we may generate a little more revenue per page, but we're going to start to hurt our audience, and over the long run, revenue will decline. So I think you know, making sure everyone knows who is ultimately the decision maker, they can put their arguments forward, right? And then that decision maker has to be able to kind of arbitrate and figure out what's best in the long run.
So our next question is from Ernest Wilkins. His question is, what can a modern old guard newspaper, think the Chicago Tribune versus the New York Times, do to attract and retain the star talent that can drive much needed audience to their sites? Is that even a thing anymore? What does the rock star beat writer or columnist situation look like in 2023 and beyond for these slower moving organizations? So this is something that I've written a little bit about in my newsletter. Obviously we've been seeing a trend where a lot of star writers, a lot of star reporters have basically broken off, quit their jobs at the New York Times, Vox Media, others, and launched on Substack or launched their own podcast or YouTube channel, and basically built up, multiplied their salaries by many times. Like I think Matt Iglesias, for instance, is now making over $1 million a year on Substack. I can guarantee you he wasn't getting paid that at Vox Media. So an era where you invest in a journalist, you build up their star power, their reach, and then just at the point where you're going to start realizing that return on investment, they then go off on their own, and you lose out on all that training that you did. What do you think that the next era of like basically mainstream media, how they're going to kind of mitigate these things going forward?
I think it's, yeah, I mean, I think it's just a fact of being in this business, and it's true of really many industries, right? It's not just in journalism and publishing. um you know there are going to be those people who go off on their own and can be successful on their own, but there are plenty of super talented and even star caliber journalists in this case that they or maybe they go off and they try it, and even if they're fairly successful, it just takes a lot really to manage your own business, right? And I think there's still going to be plenty of talented, even star caliber journalists that are going to want to write for the top quality publications, right? As long as they see strength in those publications, especially. It's so I think if the New York Times, sure, they're going to lose writers, but they're also going to attract writers. And I think there's just going to be a kind of, a slow but steady churn of talent, as there is, with any company, really.
But certainly, like the problem is
But
more acute today than it ever has in history. Like if you think of like 30 years ago, like
sure,
if you were a star political columnist at a newspaper, and you wanted to keep on writing columns, not write books necessarily, like you really had nowhere to go. Like you
right. There
could
were
go to
no
a competitor.
alternatives.
Yeah, like you would maybe go to a competitor and have to move to a different city or something like that. But the mobility
Yeah.
wasn't as easy. Whereas now it's easier than ever. Like one thought that I've shared in my newsletter is the idea that media companies are going to need to act a little bit more like book publishers or music labels, where they're almost like talent management,
Yeah.
where there's some kind of equity or revenue share involved. I don't know how much you've been following Puck, which was started by a Vanity Fair alum,
Oh, yeah.
where basically they recruited a few star writers, they gave them salaries and benefits, but then they also gave them equity and then a cut of any revenue, so incentives
Sure.
to bring in paid subscribers. Do you think like media companies will? We're starting to see some edge cases. Forbes was doing some of that as well. I mean, do you think 20 years from now the New York Times is going to be offering like the equivalent of almost like book contracts, but for their journalists, where there's like an incentive structure put into there that rewards them for really doing well?
Potentially. I mean, there's certainly a lot of startups that are, either trying the collective model, some kind of model where, yes, the kind of the founding team, or even, beyond the founding team, everyone gets to participate in the upside of the business through equity or in other ways. And sure, that's certainly one way to do it. And I could, some larger media companies do that already, right? You can, whether you're on the business side or the editorial side, you may get, stock or options. There are pluses and minuses to that. But I honestly, I think, again, it's not just within media where you've seen this. Um, you know, I think star talent or high performers in just about every industry, um, you know, has a little more control over, or at least has more options, right? And more opportunities to make money outside of their core, their kind of their core job. So, certainly in sports, you can see that, whether it's through merchandising, even athletes that were in small markets, whether it's, they're making the highlight reels, what used to be just on ESPN, they're on, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. So you can be in a small market, but still be seen by, millions of fans, and it elevates their overall profile, so you can do endorsement deals. And so I think high performers do have more opportunity in, entertainment, sports, other industries these days. I'm not sure, other than being a great employer, what else you can do, right, to try to retain talent. I just think you have to provide opportunity. um, you know Again, it's hybrid work. How many days a week do you have to work in the office versus at home? I mean, all these things have been coming up, and certainly you know, the power shifted a bit toward the worker versus the employer. And I think that trend will continue, or will have to continue, if you want to retain top talent.
And part of it is about just like the brand and reach, right? Like it gets like if you're a top tier writer, like, or someone with 500,000 Twitter followers like Matt Iglesias, you can make a pretty good living. But there are a lot of quote unquote star writers who would still probably struggle to build a business on their own without having to do their own marketing and business development and stuff like that. And media companies
Absolutely.
still offer that.
Of course. Yeah, and that was, I guess, where I was going initially, is it's really hard to become a successful creator, right? An individual, that while there are many, many more tools, and there are companies that can help with that, help provide some of um, the some of what a larger company will offer. There are these other businesses that will help provide the platform, and they'll handle some of that for you. But you still have to piece everything together, and so there's a very tiny fraction of, I think, the star talent that can be hugely successful on their own, and can, manage it well. That's obvious, that's who you're going to hear about. But I think, you know, there's a whole other layer below that that can be very successful and can take advantage of all these tools and opportunities. But I don't think it's it goes much beyond that, so that um, the the successful, well-run media companies, I think they'll still be able to retain, talent, and even top talent, and even star talent, um, the way they always have.
So we have a few more questions, but we're coming up on the end of the hour. So I just want to end with one final one. This is another one from Bo Bruskern. Is ChatGPT the downfall of news aggregation, and what will make that happen? So I guess to kind of tee up the answer to this question, there's like a lot of theories about how AI will, affect the news media. Some people think it spells doom for it, but there's a more optimistic take, and one that I basically subscribe to, is that over the last 15 years or so, there were a lot of jobs within media that weren't really highly valued. They were like given to like young 20 somethings that didn't get paid very well. And it was basically creating content for an algorithm, for the Google algorithm, for the Facebook algorithm. These are like the what time is the Super Bowl. This is the basically the reblogging of John Oliver's rant the night before. That kind of like low energy aggregation and curation role. Where do you kind of fall on that spectrum of the effects of AI, at least in the near future, on media companies?
Yeah, I mean, this again, this is a big question. There's a lot of ways to go with this, but I do certainly it's going to make uh, you know people across the spectrum more productive, right? So at a minimum, I think that's the positive, right? People will be able to push some busy work off onto whether it's ChatGPT or other AI tools. Um, there certainly from an aggregation standpoint, and I think it's probably less in news, but right, I mean, I think it's more in lifestyle, in evergreen content, right? Content that has a longer shelf life. That's really where I think people, at least in the media industry, have been concerned that, um, Google Bard, ChatGPT, any of the AI powered tools could really disrupt um, the ecosystem that helped, again, lifestyle content, evergreen content, less of the in the kind of headline news. So that's where I think you can see, right, people going searching for something, and you're going to have a chat generated response rather than in the search engine results seeing links off to um, you know, a a home site, right, or a family site, or a health and wellness site. Although there, I think the chat products have to be a little more careful, but I think the impact will be felt with sure with kind of the more of the news you can use versus hard news.
Well, like, one thing publishers have invested a lot in the last few years is e-commerce and affiliate type
Right.
verticals, like reviews of products, deal roundups, stuff like that. And that's become like a major part of their revenue. I, for one, I'm always going to check Wirecutter first before, anything else. So, like, I think
Right.
someone that has like a great brand like that is going to be okay. But
Sure.
what do you think? Like, do you think like e-commerce verticals or e-commerce like content is under threat since that's the more evergreen content that you're speaking to?
Yeah. I mean, I do. I do. I don't think it's going, I think, look, Google has certainly as the leader right now, they have an incentive to continue sending traffic or presenting search results in a way that they can continue to monetize it as well. So whether that means including, citations back to the sites that provided the information that allowed them to summarize, right? The citations are adding in, related content from sites. So there will still be traffic sent off to these sites. I just think it's impossible to imagine a scenario where there isn't some kind of negative impact. And so, and like you said, I think if you have a very strong brand, you have a lot of authority and credibility, you're much safer. I think having a community is going to be incredibly important, right? And that typically will go along with having a strong brand and having that authority. But even there, some sites, Wirecutter, I'm not sure what it would look like, but if there was some community that went along with that, right, where there's a lively discussion around the top products and forums, right? There was a great, I forget what it's called, but that type of experience where you want more context and more firsthand accounts of product use. And I think it's going to be harder for chat products to just provide a summary and then say, here's the top. the top response. So, um, you know, authority, community, closer to the end user, that type of experience, I think, is where you're safest in media with evergreen content for sure.
Well, more intentional media consumption, like
Right.
listening to podcasts, reading a newsletter, going to read like a
Yes.
long form article in the New Yorker. Like that's not just about I'll take this information from whomever. You're trying to get information specifically from that source.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Craig. Well, we're at the end of the hour. Those are all the questions I have for you. Where can my listeners find you online?
So I'm on Twitter at Craigett, so Craigett. That's also my Instagram account. I'm on LinkedIn, so yeah, you'll find me in most social places.
How do potential clients usually get in touch with you?
Uh, right. So my consulting company is called Cluttered Desk. So you can go to cluttereddesk.co, and you can read about my site and my services. What we provide.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks a lot.